The American colonel had an individual cell in the special block. He was allowed to leave the hut during the evening and was given special meals. Rumour had it that the King of Sweden had intervened on his behalf at the request of President Roosevelt himself. This colonel had once given Major Nikonov a bar of chocolate when he was ill. He was very interested in the Russian prisoners of war and was always trying to start up conversations with them about German tactics and the causes of the disasters in 1941. He'd often talk to Yershov. Sometimes he looked into his bright, thoughtful eyes and forgot that he couldn't speak English. He found it hard to believe that a man with such an intelligent face could fail to understand him, especially when what they were saying was such consuming interest. "I can't believe it," he'd say. "You really don't understand?" And Yershov would answer in Russian, "The old sergeant had a fine command of every kind of language, except foreign ones." Nevertheless, in a language composed of smiles, glances, slaps on the back, and 10 or 15 words of atrociously mangled Russian, French, German and English, the Russians were able to discuss comradeship, solidarity, fellow-feeling, love of one's home, love of one's wife and children, with people from dozens of different countries. Kamerad, gut, Brot, Suppe, Kinder, Zigarette, Arbeit, and another dozen words that had originated in the camps themselves. Revier, Blockälteste, Capo, Vernichtungslager, Appell, Appellplatz, Waschraum, Flugpunkt, Lagerschütze were enough to express anything of real importance in the simple yet bewildering life of the prisoners. There were also several Russian words, Rebiata, Chabachok, Tovarish, that were also used by other nationalities. As for the word Dokhodyaga, meaning a prisoner who was on his last legs, this has been accepted by all 56 nationalities. The Soviet prisoners of war were unable even to agree amongst themselves. Some were ready to die rather than betray their country, while others considered joining up with Vlasov. The more they talked and argued, the less they understood each other. In the end they fell silent, full of mutual contempt and hatred. And in this silence of the dumb, and these speeches of the blind, in this medley of people bound together by the same grief, terror and hope, in this hatred and lack of understanding between men who spoke the same tongue, you could see much of the tragedy of the 20th century. The conversations of the Russian prisoners of war were particularly sad on the evening after the first snowfall. Even men as energetic and self-disciplined as Colonel Zato Krylets and Brigade Commissar Osipov had fallen into a gloomy silence. Major Kirillov was sitting beside Mostovskoy. His shoulders were drooping, and his head was nodding slowly up and down. The whole of his vast body seemed filled with melancholy. As for his dark eyes, they were like the eyes of someone with terminal cancer. Looking into such eyes, even a man's nearest and dearest would hope that his sufferings would soon be over. Pointing at Kirillov, the ubiquitous Kotikov whispered to Osipov, either he's about to hang himself, or he's going to join up with Vlasov. Mostovskoy rubbed the grey stubble on his cheeks and said, "Listen, Cossacks, everything's fine. Can't you see that? Every day that the state created by Lenin continues to exist is a death blow to fascism. Fascism has no choice. It must either destroy us or perish. The hatred fascism bears us is yet another proof, a far-reaching proof of the justice of Lenin's cause. The more the fascists hate us, the more certain we can be of our own rightness. And in the end we will defeat them." He turned to Kirillov. "What's the matter with you? Don't you remember that story of Gorky's? How he was walking up and down the prison courtyard and a Georgian shouted out, 'Hold your head up! You look like a bedraggled chicken!' Everyone burst out laughing. And he was quite right. We must hold our heads high. Just think, the Soviet state is defending the ideals of communism. Do you think Hitler can get the better of that? Stalingrad is still holding out. It may have seemed before your war that we were going too far, that we had really tightened the screws, but now even a blind man can see that the end justifies the means. We certainly did tighten the screws, said Yershov. That's for sure. We didn't tighten them enough, said General Gutz. We should have gone further still. Then Hitler wouldn't have reached the Volga. It's not for us to give lessons to Stalin, said Osipov. True enough, said Mostovskoy. And if we perish in prisons or damp mines, then that's that. We must just think of something else. Such as? Asked Yershov loudly. Everyone exchanged glances, looked away, and fell silent. Oh, Kirillov, said Yershov abruptly. The old man's quite right. We should rejoice the fascists hate us. We hate them and they hate us, right? But just imagine being sent to a Russian camp. That really would be hard. But as for this, we're stout-hearted lads. We'll give the Germans a run for their money. General Chuikov, the commander of the 62nd Army, had lost all contact with his troops. Most of the wireless sets had gone dead, and the telephone cables had all been severed. Sometimes it seemed as though the gently rippling Volga was something fixed and stable, and that the quaking earth was huddling against its still margins. From the left bank, hundreds of pieces of Soviet heavy artillery kept up a constant barrage. Round the German positions on the southern slopes of Mamayev Kurgan, the earth whirled into the air like smoke. These clouds of earth then passed through the sieve of gravity, the heavier lumps falling straight to the ground, the dust rising into the sky. Several times during the day, the soldiers had fought off attacks by German tanks and infantry. Their eyes were bloodshot and their ears deafened. To the senior officers cut off from their troops, the day seemed interminable. Zhukov, Krylov and Gurov had tried everything under the sun to fill in the time. They'd invented work for themselves, written letters, argued about what the enemy might do next, drunk vodka with and without something to eat, and had listened in silence to the roar of the guns. An iron whirlwind howled over the bunker, slicing through anything living that raised its head above the earth's surface. The army headquarters was paralysed. Let's have a game of fool, said Chuikov, pushing aside a large ashtray full of cigarette ends. Even Krylov, the chief of staff, had lost his composure. Drumming his fingers on the table, he said, I can't imagine anything worse. We're just sitting here, waiting to be eaten. Chuikov dealt, announced, Hearts are trumps, and then suddenly scattered the cards. I can't bear it, he exclaimed. We're just sitting in our holes like rabbits. He sat there in silence. His face was agonized and full of hatred. As though predicting his own end, Gurov murmured thoughtfully, Another day like this, and I'll have a heart attack. He suddenly burst out laughing and said, At the divisional command post, it's impossible even to go to the bog during the day. I heard Duidnikov's chief of staff once jumped down into the bunker and shouted, Hurrah! I've been for a shit! He looked round and there was a lady doctor he was in love with. The German air raids stopped at dusk. A man arriving in Stalingrad at night, deafened by the guns, might well imagine that some cruel fate had brought him there just as a major offensive was being launched. For the veterans, however, this was the time to shave, to wash clothes and write letters. For the turners, mechanics, soldierers and watchmakers, this was the time to repair clocks, cigarette lighters, cigarette holders, and the oil lamps made from old shell cases with strips of greatcoat as wicks. In the flickering light from the shell bursts, you could see the banks of the river, the oil tanks and factory chimneys, the ruins of the city itself. The view was sullen and sinister. In the dark, the signal centre came to life again. Typewriters clattered away as they copied dispatches. Motors hummed, orders were tapped out in Morse code, telephonists exchanged messages as the command posts of divisions, regiments, batteries and companies were once again connected up. Signals officers, who had just arrived, gave measured coughs as they waited to give their reports to the duty officer. Poshatsky, the elderly artillery commander, General Tkachenko, the sapper in charge of the dangerous river crossing, Guriev, the newly arrived commander of the Siberian division, and Lieutenant Colonel Batyuk, the Stalingrad veteran, whose division was disposed below Mamayev Kurgan, all hurried to report to Chuikov and Krylov. At the front line itself, letters folded into triangles were handed to postmen, and the dead were buried, to spend the first night of their eternal rest beside the dugouts and trenches where their comrades were writing letters, shaving, eating bread, drinking tea, and washing in improvised baths. This was the beginning of the most difficult period for the defenders of Stalingrad. In the confusion of the street fighting, of the different attacks and counterattacks, of the struggle for the House of Specialists, for the mill, for the State Bank, and for each square, courtyard and cellar, the superiority of the German forces was indisputable. The wedge the Germans had driven into the southern part of Stalingrad was widening every day. From the positions beside the water, German machine gunners were able to cover the left bank to the south of Krasnaya Sloboda. The staff officers responsible for plotting the position of the front line on the map saw how inexorably the blue markers moved forward from day to day, how the band separating the red line of the Soviet defences from the light blue of the Volga grew steadily thinner. The initiative at this time belonged to the Germans. For all their fury, the Russian counterattacks could do nothing to halt their remorseless advance. From dawn to dusk the sky was filled with the whine of German dive bombers pounding the earth with their high explosive bombs, and hundreds of men lived day after day with the same terrible question, what will happen tomorrow, or next week, when the thin band of Soviet defences is reduced to a thread, when this thread is snapped by the iron teeth of the German offensive. Late that night, General Krylov lay down to sleep in the bunker. His temples throbbed and his throat burned. He'd smoked dozens of cigarettes that day. He licked his dry palate and turned over to face the wall. As he lay there, half asleep, he remembered the fighting in Odessa and Sebastopol, the shouts of the Romanian infantry as they attacked, Sebastopol and its naval splendour, Odessa and its cobble-paved courtyards cloaked in ivy. Once again, he was back at the command post in Sebastopol. General Petrov's pince-nez was gleaming through the mist. The gleam broke into 1,000 splinters, and he saw the sea, a grey cloud. The dust, raised by shell bursts on the cliffs, floated above the heads of the soldiers and sailors, and stood over Sapun Mountain. He could hear the waves lapping unconcernedly against the launch. Then a gruff voice from below, "Jump!" and he leapt into the deep and landed on the hull of the submarine. He took his last look at Sebastopol, at the stars, at the fires on the shore. The war kept its hold on him even while he was asleep. The submarine was taking him to Novorossiysk. His legs were numb. His chest and back were damp with sweat. The noise of the engines was beating against his temples. Then the engines cut out and the submarine settled quietly onto the seabed. The closeness inside was unbearable. The ceiling, crisscrossed by dotted lines of riveting, was crushing him. Then he heard a roar and a splash. A depth charge had exploded. The submarine lurched and he was thrown out of his bunk. He opened his eyes and found everything in flames. There was a stream of fire running towards the Volga, past the open door of the bunker. He could hear shouting and the rattle of Tommy guns. "Put this over your head, quick!" shouted a soldier he had never seen before. He was thrusting an overcoat towards him. Krylov pushed him aside. "Where's Chuikov?" he shouted. Suddenly he realized what had happened. The oil tanks were on fire. Flaming oil was streaming past towards the Volga. It seemed impossible to escape from the liquid fire. It leapt up, humming and crackling, from the streams of oil that were filling the hollows and craters and rushing down the communication trenches. Saturated with oil, even the clay and stone were beginning to smoke. The oil itself was gushing out in black, glossy streams from tanks that had been riddled by incendiary bullets. It was as though sheets of flame and smoke had been sealed inside these tanks and were now slowly unrolling. The life that had reigned hundreds of millions of years before, the terrible life of the primeval monsters, had broken out of its deep tombs, howling and roaring, stamping its huge feet. It was devouring everything round about. The fire rose thousands of feet, carrying with it clouds of vaporized oil that exploded into flame only high in the sky. The mass of flame was so vast that the surrounding whirlwind was unable to bring enough oxygen to the burning molecules of hydrocarbon. A black, swaying vault separated the starry sky of autumn from the burning earth. It was terrible to look up and see a black firmament streaming with oil. The columns of flame and smoke looked at one moment like living things seized by horror and fury, at another moment like quivering poplars and aspens, like women with long streaming hair. The black clouds and red flames joined together in a wild dance. The blazing oil formed a thin film over the water, hissing, smoking, and twisting as it was caught by the current. It was surprising how quickly the soldiers managed to find a path to the bank. Some of them made 2 or 3 journeys back to the flaming bunkers, helping the staff officers to the promontory where, between 2 streams of fire flowing into the Volga, a small group of men were standing in safety. They had already rescued Chuikov himself. They had carried Krylov, who had been considered lost, out of the flames. Blinking their scorched eyelashes, they forced their way back to the bunkers through the thickets of red dogrose. The staff officers of the 62nd Army stood until morning on this small promontory. Between shielding their faces from the scorching air and brushing off the sparks that fell on their clothes, they kept looking round at Chuikov. He had a soldier's greatcoat thrown over his shoulders, and locks of hair were sticking out under his service cap. He looked calm and thoughtful. Gurov looked round and said, "It seems that even fire can't burn us." He began fingering the hot buttons on his greatcoat. "Hey, you there with the spade!" shouted the chief sapper, General Tachenko. "Dig a channel through here, otherwise we'll have flames coming down on us from that mound." He turned to Krylov. "Everything's back to front, Comrade General. Fire flows like water, and the Volga's burning. Thank God there's no wind to speak of, otherwise we'd be roasted alive." Now and then a breeze did blow from the Volga, and the great tent of flames swayed towards them. A few men went right down to the river and splashed water over their boots. It evaporated immediately off the hot leather. Some men stared silently down at the ground. Some were continually looking over their shoulders. Some tried to crack jokes. "You don't even need matches. You can just light up from the wind on the Volga." Others kept feeling themselves, shaking their heads as they touched the hot metal clasps on their belts. A few hand grenades exploded inside the dugouts of the headquarters battalion. Then there was a rattle of machine gun fire. A German mortar bomb whistled through the flames to explode in the Volga. Through the smoke they glimpsed distant figures. They were probably trying to divert the flames, but everything vanished again in flames and smoke. Peering into the flames, Krylov had room in his head for only one thought: whether or not the Germans would exploit the fire and launch an attack. The Germans didn't know the location of the army command post. A prisoner they'd taken yesterday had refused to believe it was still on the right bank, and this seemed to be merely a local operation. Yes, there was a chance of surviving till morning, as long as the wind didn't get up. He looked at Chuikov, who was standing beside him, gazing into the fire. His soot-covered face seemed to be made of incandescent copper. When he took off his cap and drew his hand through his hair, he looked like a village blacksmith. He was covered in sweat, and sparks were leaping over his head. He gazed up at the cupola of fire and then down at the Volga. The few spaces of darkness over the river were clearly outlined against the twisting and coiling flames. Krylov imagined that Chirkov was fretting over the same questions as he was. Would the Germans launch a major offensive that night? Where should they relocate the command post if they survived till morning? Chirkov sensed Krylov's gaze and smiled. Tracing a wide circle in the air with one hand, he said, "Quite a spectacle, isn't it? Damn it!" The fire was clearly visible from the headquarters of the Stalingrad front on the left bank. The Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Zakharov, went straight to Yeremenko after receiving the first report. Yeremenko ordered him to go to the signal centre in person and get through to Chirkov. Breathing heavily, Zakharov hurried along. An orderly was lighting the way with a flashlight. Now and then he would say, "Careful, Comrade General," as he pushed aside the branches of apple trees that were hanging over the path. The distant glow lit up the tree trunks and lay in rose-coloured stains over the earth. The surrounding silence, broken only by the low calls of the sentries, made this pale, mute fire seem still more threatening. The duty signaller, a young girl, told Zakharov that they had lost all contact with Chirkov, telephone, telegraph, and radio. "And with the divisions?" asked Zakharov quickly. "We were in touch with Batyuk only a moment ago, Comrade Lieutenant General." "Get him for me at once." Zakharov was notorious for his quick temper. The girl was afraid even to look at him again. Then she suddenly handed him the receiver and said joyfully, "Here, Comrade General." On the other end of the line was Batyuk's Chief of Staff. Like the girl, he grew increasingly nervous as he heard Zakharov's heavy breathing and imperious voice. "What's going on over there? Give me a report. Are you in contact with Chirkov?" The Chief of Staff told Zakharov about the burning oil tanks and the wave of flame that had swept down on the army command post. They had been unable to make contact with Chirkov, but it did seem that not everyone there had perished. Through the fire and smoke, they could make out a group of people standing on the bank, but the river itself was on fire, and there was no way of reaching them. Batyuk had set out with the headquarters company to draw off the fire and rescue the survivors. When he finished his report, Zakharov said, "Tell Chirkov, if he's alive, tell Chirkov." Surprised by the long pause, the young girl glanced timidly at Zakharov. He was wiping the tears from his eyes with a handkerchief. That night, 40 officers from Army HQ were burned to death in collapsed bunkers.